Good afternoon, and thanks for taking the time to join today's webinar. Is your board cyber ready? What all private directors should do now about cyber risk. My name is Diane Johnson, and I'm part of the marketing team at Diligent. Before we get started today, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar should last about 45 minutes. It will be recorded, and a replay will be sent out to all registrants shortly after this session. Please feel free to share the replay with your colleagues. Also, feel free to ask your questions at any time by utilizing the questions pane in the GoToWebinar panel. I'm joined today by my colleagues Dottie Schindlinger, Mark Trombacki, and Mary Landry. Dottie is Diligent's governance technology evangelist. In this role, she's provided thought leadership on governance and technology topics for a variety of print and digital publications. She teaches dozens of webinars annually and presents both at conferences and in boardrooms to directors and executives globally. Dottie is a founding member of a board management software platform. Mark is a strategic cybersecurity and risk management executive who is a CPA and NACD governance fellow. He earned his CERT certificate in cybersecurity oversight and an MBA in finance from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He will complete his cybersecurity management graduate certificate in 2017 from the University of Virginia. Mark is the founder and managing principal of Risk Management Levers. Rear Admiral Mary Landry is an NACD Board Leadership Fellow and earned her CERT certificate in cybersecurity oversight. She is an independent corporate board director for USAA and SCORE. She has over 35 years of experience managing crises effectively, including the BP oil spill, 9/11, and the H1N1 pandemic. Now I'd like to hand things over to Dottie, Mark, and Kathy to take us through the rest of today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Diane. And again, we apologize, everyone, for those little audio glitches. We'll make sure that Mark has an opportunity to tell us a bit more about the Private Directors Association towards the end of today's webinar. But first, what I'd like to do is have a conversation quickly with Mary. And thank you again, Diane, for the introductions and for welcoming us to the webinar. Mary, I'd like to talk a little bit about your expertise. In particular, I know that as we were preparing for the webinar, you went to the 5 key principles that the National Association of Corporate Directors have laid out as a summary of the board's role in cybersecurity. And so what I'd like to start is to ask you, out of those 5 principles, which one do you feel resonates as being the most important for private corporate board members, and why?
Thank you, Dottie. That's a great question. And obviously, I support all 5 principles, but I think the best place to start is with principle number 1, treating cybersecurity as an enterprise-wide risk management issue. We're all familiar with the time when we left the IT and the technology work up to the experts, and we've crossed an important threshold in the digital age, which requires we understand the shared responsibility, and I repeat, shared responsibility that we have. Whether you're a board member, a CEO, part of the executive leadership team, the chief technology officer, we all have a shared responsibility in dealing with the challenges of cybersecurity.
Thank you, Mary. That's helpful. And I know that the National Association of Corporate Directors works across the spectrum of publicly owned, privately held, family-owned company boards, with the Private Directors Association focusing on privately held and family-owned companies. How do you see the work of PDA assisting privately held and family-owned corporate board members in implementing these 5 principles? Is it different for publicly traded companies, or is it the same?
Dottie, I'd venture to say that different companies are at different stages of implementing the 5 principles, depending on their type of business and their risk situation. So the point about establishing the framework, which is proportional to your risk, is really key here. And we hope that through the webinar series and the upcoming workshop, we can provide some help in addressing how best to approach cybersecurity. And while the framework applies to both privately and publicly traded companies, PDA has the benefit of working to support your efforts in the private setting of a workshop. It certainly seems like publicly traded companies are under such great scrutiny on their journey. We've got the Equifax event, we have Deloitte, We had the Sony event. We've had so many things happen to publicly traded companies, and they're under extraordinary scrutiny. So I think no one is immune, but we really hope to be able to provide some, no-fault exercises and tabletop discussions that allow everybody to proceed on the journey.
Thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense. So now I'd like to turn it over to Mark, but before I do that, Mark, are you able to hear us, and are we able to hear you?
I am able to hear you. Can you hear me now?
We sure can. Oh, that's wonderful. You sound fantastic.
Excellent.
So hopefully we've had our glitch for the time.
There's always one, right?
Always one. Well, so continuing on with that theme, I know that as we were, getting ready for this session, and Diane, if you want to go on to the next slide there, you had a great way of summarizing the role of the board in cybersecurity by providing these 5 R's of cybersecurity. And so I know that you wanted to share those with the webinar attendees because it's very easy to remember 5 R's, and it also kind of takes the mystique out of cybersecurity preparation for the board. But I'd like to know, out of those 5 R's, which one do you think is the most important for private corporate board members to do, and why?
Well, I think readiness is really the top one on my list. If a private company thinks that cybercrime won't happen to them, they're highly likely to sound very surprised, like a COO of a company that had to be sold after a cyber attack. That's how badly damaged the company's reputation was afterwards. It just couldn't continue under the same name. Readiness is the foundation because about 80% of cybersecurity incidents could be avoided by practicing the basics.
That's helpful. And so what would you think would be the best method for a board to encourage that kind of readiness?
Well, as Mary noted, the cybersecurity is an enterprise risk, and as such, incorporate cybersecurity risk management into your firm's existing risk management practices. Don't make cybersecurity a standalone IT problem. Cybersecurity risk is just another category, another flavor, if you will, of risk that can impact your enterprise. So do make it part of the corporation's risk management practices. If your firm doesn't have an existing risk management system, then the most important first step to take in addressing cybersecurity risk is to practice the basics.
And I can see how basics could easily get overwhelmed by the complexity of the topic. So, Mark, could you provide some specific questions that you think private company board directors should be asking?
You bet, Dottie. As a private company board member, here are 5 example questions that you could consider. 1, have we identified and categorized the data we are trying to protect? What are the so-called crown jewels of the company? There isn't enough time or money to protect every piece of data, so it's important to understand what data is the most important and valuable. Prioritization is key. 2, have we performed a risk assessment? If so, what risk assessment framework have we selected and why? There are numerous frameworks available. Selecting one or more to match your environment is a decision that should have a strong rationale. 3, do we have a set of basic policies in place? How often are those policies updated? Depending on the size of your organization and the cyber risk you face, policies on acceptable use, bring your own device, downloading of software, all help to shape the cybersecurity profile and communicate a cyber-aware culture to your employees. And the good news is, there are many great online resources which can help you jumpstart this process. You don't have to start from scratch. The 4th question you could consider: what is the nature and extent of the training and awareness program in place? Does it also include contractors and consultants as well as employees, since those non-employee groups can often have access to your systems and data? 5, do major decision processes such as M&A and third-party agreements include a cyber filter? Catching cyber issues early on in the decision-making process will help to minimize reacting to and chasing problems down the road. I think the overarching idea is to create a strong foundation, one that is flexible enough to grow with the company as well as changes in the operating environment. I think the other key is just to get started. As you mentioned, Dottie, cyber can feel overwhelming, but like many areas of business, it needs to be handled one step at a time.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. And so, Mary, I want to invite you to comment a little bit on these topics. I know that in our preparation, you had mentioned that you would choose resiliency as another important aspect of those 5 R's that private company directors should do. So why resiliency?
Thank you, Dottie. You know, it's a great question, and I think resilience is key. You know, how you anticipate what's going to happen, where your company might be vulnerable, how you're going to prepare to get yourself through something, doing things as simple as board discussions or tabletop exercises like we have at the upcoming workshop, and how you recover from an attack are key to not just surviving, but to thriving. And we've heard the stories of companies that haven't survived a cyber attack. So I think building resilience offers you the opportunity to embark on the journey rather than being in a reactionary mode. And it certainly allows you time to take a more strategic approach to the challenges and to make decisions in a very thoughtful and measured way rather than making rush decisions that might have unintended consequences.
Thank you, Mary. That's really helpful. And I know that you are the expert in managing all sorts of crises effectively, not just cybersecurity crises. And so I'm curious to know if there's a common pattern that you've seen in the key decisions made by those in charge that can determine the success or failure in confronting a crisis, including cybersecurity.
Thanks, Dottie. It's ironic. I'm sitting in Plymouth, England, working with a lot of oil companies, and we're having the discussion about oil spill response. And the whole discussion about planning and preparedness is so key. And even though every situation is different, I would say there's common elements and principles that can work across various situations. And we have a common saying, you don't want to be exchanging business cards or having to make rush decisions in the midst of an event. So as a nation, I'd say we've come a long way in planning and preparedness journey. You know, each time we face an event, we take the lessons learned, they become lessons applied. I mean, you look at the recent hurricanes and how improved FEMA is from the days of Katrina. They arrived at this through years of planning and preparedness. And I'd say many of the federal and state agencies and the private sector have all been on this journey and been involved, whether it's power companies, financial institutions, small businesses. You know, we continue to evolve our capabilities in how to prepare and respond to events. But it's really important to note that even FEMA in doing all this preparedness, they now include a cyber element in their exercises. You know, what if we have a denial of service in the midst of an important event? How are we gonna respond to that? Or the cyber guard exercise that's done with the National Security Agency and DoD and other intelligence agencies, they actually include engagement with the private sector, because the private sector does critical infrastructure and they obviously are involved in, you know, the financial sector and all the things that are so important for our society to function and thrive. So I think it's an acknowledgement that we're all in this together, right down to the private citizen. And I think Mark's recommendations earlier really speak to that. What can every single person do now, no matter how large or small your organization is or your company is? How can we all be involved? And as I said, like 90% of our critical infrastructure is privately owned. So certainly private sector companies are so important to this solution to how we address cybersecurity. So I encourage companies, you know, take the first step, get involved in planning and preparedness. It doesn't have to be extremely expensive other than your time and effort. You can make an informed decision on how to apply your resources to manage the risk that's posed by cybersecurity.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. That's really helpful. Mark, I want to turn it back over to you. I know that you recently wrote a white paper called Closing the Cybersecurity Risk Door that appeared in Intelligent Risk. And that's a quarterly professional journal published by Professional Risk Managers Association International. And in that white paper, you quoted 2 facts that I found particularly frightening. The first was that 60% of small companies are unable to sustain their business within 6 months of a cyber attack. And the second was that 90% of all cyber attacks begin with a human weakness. Given that it's the human weaknesses that are creating the openings for major cyber attacks, what can be done about that?
Those are scary statistics, aren't they, Dottie? The good news is there are
They really are.
Good news is there are numerous ways to enhance employees' awareness, which will help to curtail this human weakness factor. One simple yet powerful practice is to couple company-focused cybersecurity awareness programs with personal or at-home cybersecurity tips to make it more memorable and important to employees. Cybersecurity is important to all of us at work and at home. We are connected 24/7, so our exposure to cyber risks don't end with the conclusion of our workdays. Educating employees on securing their mobile devices, the risks of social media usage, online safety, and other topics of interest to them and their families will increase engagement while helping organizations achieve their internal cybersecurity awareness objectives. Finding ways that engage the employee in interesting, real-life situations can also be quite impactful in changing employee behavior. Although companies do continue to need strong technological defenses, simply purchasing new technology won't increase the level of security. Employees need to understand and practice their critical personal role in strong cyber hygiene and overall information management security. So let me close, Dottie, with a more positive fact to support our intuition for the need to engage employees in the security process. Wombat Security Technologies and the Aberdeen Group found that an investment in user awareness and training effectively changes behavior to reduce security-related risks by 45 to 70%. I think those are amazing numbers as well. So curtailing the human weakness factor can be a very effective way to dramatically improve your cybersecurity profile.
That's great. Thank you so much, Mark. And, what you're talking about just resonates so much with me. I know that in terms of, kind of the overall need for organizations to really begin to embrace some of these issues, and in particular for directors to embrace these issues, both in terms of understanding what the company is doing to ensure cybersecurity, but also really just kind of upping the level of understanding and awareness at the director level themselves of their own risk and their own accountability as it relates to cybersecurity. I think both of those things are very important. And so one of the things that I wanted to share with this webinar, we had recently done some research through Diligent with public company directors, and this was done through the New York Stock Exchange, just to kind of get a sense for current board practices as it relates to communication and as it relates to awareness of cyber risk. And some of the statistics I can share with you that kind of jumped out at us. First and foremost, that 92% of directors are still using unsecured personal email to communicate board business with one another, which is kind of a frightening statistic. It's certainly understandable in terms of the convenience back to the director, but from a cyber risk profile, it's really a bit more frightening, particularly because many of the worst cyber attacks are being levied at email and through spear phishing and directly at those that have access to sensitive information. So that's a little bit frightening. But more so, when we asked whether or not the board had ever received any cybersecurity training, 62% of them told us no. So that's, I think, an area where certainly organizations can, as you're talking about, Mark, really not spend a ton of money, but make a huge impact. Very simple training exists, and you mentioned a couple of providers, which are great, but really just very simple training can go a long way to just helping to raise people's level of awareness, maybe asking them to take one extra moment before they click on a link in an email to really verify whether or not that is truly coming from the person they expected it to. Really just taking that kind of extra moment of caution and care can make a giant difference, especially because, as you pointed out, the vast majority of cyber attacks start with that place where the person interacts with the technology. And so, spending some time really trying to shore up the level of security of the people is definitely a good place to spend some time and energy. So I want to kind of continue on with our conversation here and ask a couple more questions. So first of all, I'd like to talk again with Mark, if you don't mind, just kind of continuing on with this theme. As companies begin to outsource more of their activities focused on core competencies, I'm curious to know your thoughts around whether vendors represent incremental risk to the organization from a cyber perspective.
Patty, that's a great question. Yes, third-party providers certainly reshape the risk profile of a particular organization. Outsourcing parts of your business process that are not core to a company's mission is something that many organizations do to gain efficiency and effectiveness. However, since outsourcing is often an extension of your business practices and processes, those third-party providers will likely have access to your systems and data similar to areas and people inside the organization. As a result, this new external relationship can create risk. Now, specifically as it applies to cyber risk, outsourcers may have access to sensitive data, including data protected by law. This data may be moving outside of your environment to be stored, analyzed, manipulated, and ultimately returned. Each of those steps creates incremental risk. Consequently, not only do you need to have the right contractual protections in place, you should also review the third party's data protection safeguards and then monitor those against those commitments. So I think the role of the private director, similar to the 5 questions I talked about earlier, is to ask about cybersecurity when a new contract or outsourcing arrangement comes forward for approval.
Great, thanks, Mark. That's really helpful. Mary, I might actually want to ask you to comment on the same question because you actually have served in the role of an external resource that companies hire to come in and help them with preparedness and cyber assessments. And so I'd love to kind of hear your take on the right role for working with external vendors and how to sort of mitigate any risk that might come about as a result of working with external vendors.
Thank you, Dottie. Well, certainly there's several resources out there, guidance documents, if you will, and references to one of them is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST framework. They did 2 things right up front. The first one was a cybersecurity framework, and it provides great guidance on how the private sector can build this resilience we were talking about. And that was developed in cooperation with the private sector representatives from various sectors, including financial institutions. And they also did a document on how companies can work with vendors. How do you secure that third-party vendor interface? And then they've done everything. There's information out there on how to secure health records on mobile devices and things like that. So I think they're for working with private companies. I think just pointing out these resources that are free, available, and really have been, thought through through cooperation. NIST is obviously a government agency, but they've worked with the private sector to develop these standards, these frameworks, and these guidance documents. Another great example is Carnegie Mellon's CERT Software Engineering Institute. They've got this thing called the CERT RMM model, which is kind of a resilience management model, and it takes you through the thought process of how you might approach cybersecurity rather than make everybody nervous about vendors. Everybody relies very heavily on vendors and interfacing with their businesses. So there's a lot of resources out there, and the companies, they can find something that's suitable and applicable to their business. So I start there by pointing those things out so that not just while I'm giving a presentation or anything, but also something they can go back to and work with their teams to examine. And certainly we have this upcoming workshop that I'm so excited about that PDA is putting on, and it features experts who are familiar with a host of resources for particular business situations. So we're really encouraging people to attend, become informed, find out what will work best for them to manage this enterprise risk.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. I think that's, incredibly true and appropriate. And I want to echo what you just said about the upcoming workshop, because I do think, particularly for directors that feel that this is an area that they could, stand to become a bit more versed in, a bit more comfortable with, it's going to be, I think, just an exceptional experience. So I want to talk a little bit more, and actually we've got some questions in from the audience, which I'll be coming to here in just a moment, but I want to talk a little bit more about this notion that cybersecurity, I think at some point, really was sort of seen as something that kind of gets quote unquote handled by IT, right? Like this is something that we just count on the IT folks, the data security officer, chief security officer, they just handle it and occasionally provide a briefing to the board about how things are going. Mark, I'd like to start with you. Why should we kind of shift our thinking about that and think of IT risk as kind of enterprise-wide risk management issue, and how would you like to see the focus change a little bit for board members?
Thanks, Dottie. I think the focus is starting to change for organizations and for board members. And for starters, it means that the risk and the management of the risk is no longer siloed in IT, as you just mentioned. Now, let's face it, technology permeates every organization in a variety of ways, and so does the corresponding cybersecurity risk. And if you think about the emerging connected technology, broadly what we all call the Internet of Things, that reach really is going to continue to grow. So the IT area clearly needs to take a leadership role, but it is not solely up to them to develop and implement the entire solution. So when I think about it, this in turn means two things. Other areas must be involved in identifying and managing the risk. For example, HR may be involved with training and education, finance in determining appropriate levels of insurance, procurement and legal may be involved with third-party contracts. And of course, corporate communications will be involved in responding to breach scenarios. All of these groups have a role to play. And most importantly, leadership sets the stage for a strong cybersecurity culture. And then secondly, risk, financial, and other operating practices can be leveraged to more effectively and efficiently deal with cyber risk. As I mentioned earlier, incorporating a cyber filter into your already strong practices will be less expensive than standalone practices, but I think more importantly, more effective in managing cyber risk.
Thank you, Mark. That's really helpful. Mary, we have a question from one of the members of our audience here that I think might be really good to address to you. The question is regarding private and government joint cybersecurity concerns. How effective are those interactions, and what would you say are the best practices in place?
Well, I'd say we're in our infancy here. We still don't have legislation at the federal level that dictates, how we should interface and how we can protect businesses' proprietary information when we're having to address security issues and things like that. And so states are starting to develop. Each state is coming up with their own rules, and I think we're still in our infancy, and I think we're really challenged by this at the interface. And however, I would say that there has been some good work done, whether it's reaching out to the FBI because you're part of a team of folks and you have a critical infrastructure issue and you want them to come and take a look, and how you do the reporting. So I do think this interface is challenging at this point because we're in our infancy, but it doesn't mean we can't figure out the best way forward. And I certainly know that at the federal, everybody's very attentive to this, whether it's the private sector or the government, because it's just so critical to functioning in a digital age.
Thank you. And I would imagine that a lot of that, sort of pressure being put on new legislation, new regulation comes as a result of some of the large breaches that have happened recently. And I know there was another just announced in the Wall Street Journal this morning. And so I know there's a lot going on. The next webinar that we have coming up on October 17th is going to be focusing on the topic of breach notification and what's the right role of the board when there has been an attack or there has been a breach, in terms of notifying shareholders and stakeholders about that breach and sort of what their role is, generally speaking, around that. And so, Mary, I wonder if you want to just talk briefly. I know that you've done some of this work with clients, helping them to think that through, sort of thinking through who does what in the event of a bad incident. I wonder if you want to just talk briefly about, kind of your advice to boards of their specific role in the event of an incident.
Right. And it's a great point. And, Dottie, I always say much of our legislation comes from very significant events. And I really don't want a major cyber event in our country that forces, like the Dodd-Frank came from the financial crisis, and Oil Pollution Act of 1990 came from Exxon Valdez. I don't want a major event in this country that really brings us to our knees to develop the legislation. You'd rather see it be developed on this journey through dialogue and through sessions like we're having now. I would recommend to boards that they really approach this as how would you do a crisis response? Just have a discussion, have it on the agenda at your board meeting, and just say, how would we approach cybersecurity? What is the role of the executive team and the CEO? What is the role of the board member and the board team? How would we communicate with each other? Do we want to take a one person from the board and have them be the interface with the company so that they can, with the executive team, so that they can be freed up to address the issue and then report back to the rest of the board, so that there's this not this constant churn on how things will be communicated. So I think just sitting around with an agenda item on your board meeting, have an agenda item that basically has a sit around the table and say, how would we approach this? And you'd be surprised at what comes up in the discussion and how informed. And if you can do it with the board, the CEO, and the executive team, getting to know each other's thought processes is very helpful, and really understanding, because the worst thing you can have happen is if you haven't thought it through, and there's people tripping over each other, and because they're not clear what their roles and responsibilities are. I think establishing a little bit of a battle rhythm and an understanding of how you would approach this crisis event goes a long way in that, being ready if it should it happen.
Thank you very much. Mark, is there anything that you'd like to add to what Mary says in terms of the specific nature of the board's role around an attack?
Oh, I think Mary articulated that very clearly. The only thing I would add, or I guess two things I would add, is, one, I think it's very important, and Mary mentioned this earlier, you don't want to be exchanging business cards during a crisis, is to really line up also your external providers and make sure that the board understands who else will be engaged, whether that's legal counsel or a forensic firm or a communications firm. If you don't have those resources on staff, to make sure that there's a good understanding of who the other players are going to be from an external perspective and what role they will play. So I think that's part and parcel to what Mary was talking about. And then the other thing I would say is just to practice. It's great to have all these procedures written down and to make sure that all the dots are connected and that everybody understands what they need to do. But the real flaws in what you put together really won't become clear until you practice it. So I would just encourage, in addition to the conversation around the board table, to make sure that you go through a live scenario and practice what you've put together.
Thank you, Mark. And I wonder also if you want to comment a little bit on, the coverages that are available in terms of cyber risk, notification, or really just cyber risk insurance, and how that might impact, notifications in the event of a breach. I know we had talked about that a little bit earlier in one of our planning calls. What would you recommend to board members in terms of getting familiar with their coverages and what sort of coverage they might need to consider?
Well, I think that's another basic question that a board member needs to ask is, do we have cyber coverage as part of our main insurance policy, or have we considered a separate policy for cyber risk? The marketplace for cyber insurance continues to evolve, and as one of the sessions that we're going to have in our November 1st workshop will be to have a discussion about what is available in the marketplace at this point in time and how the market continues to evolve. So I hope that people will join us in November to have that conversation. But I think from a board perspective, just understanding what you have in place, what has been considered, are we self-insuring in terms of our cyber risk, which can also be a decision that companies make. Then if you have coverage, to really understand some of the other coverages, what are the deductibles, what's included, what's excluded, and as we talked about just a minute ago, insurance companies can also help be a very strategic partner in terms of a breach by bringing some of the other players externally to the company to respond in a breach incident.
Great, thank you so much. Well, so we have just a few minutes left, and Mark, you mentioned the upcoming, session on November 1st. I know, Mary, you also mentioned some of the activities that will be happening at that event. And so, Mark, I know that since we had a little bit of an audio glitch at the beginning, we didn't really get to hear your introduction of the Private Directors Association. And so I wondered if you would take a moment to just reintroduce PDA and, sort of the relationship between PDA and Diligent and what's coming up here at the next couple of events that we have on the plate.
You bet. I'd be happy to do that, Dottie. And, first of all, thank you for helping Mary and I navigate this very complex topic this afternoon. We really appreciate the partnership. PDA appreciates the partnership that we have with Diligent as one of our key sponsors in the cybersecurity securities, as well as other supporting other initiatives that PDA has. The Private Directors Association is an international, independent, not-for-profit organization dedicated to advancing boardroom practices and leadership in private corporations, be they corporate, ESOPs, family-owned, partnerships, private equity portfolio companies, or startups or venture capital financed companies. And because cyber is such an important consideration for private company owners and their corporate boards for the foreseeable future, know that our cybersecurity conference series, including this webinar, is just part of PDA's ongoing resources available to its members. So we've talked about our November 1st conference. It'll be called Locking the Cybersecurity Risk Door, What Every Private Company Board Member Should Do, will be delivered in Chicago. And I'm really delighted with the lineup of experts we have secured for the conference. Mary will return as a keynote speaker, and Dottie, you're going to be back again to provide your insights as well. We have a diverse set of over a dozen board members, business owners, and other experts to help us navigate the day and understand the important role of the board in cybersecurity. So we don't have time this afternoon to talk about all of our great speakers, but I do need to share one with you. A 20-year veteran of the FBI will be joining us on November 1st. Jim Traynor was the highest-ranking cyber expert at the FBI before he joined Aon last fall. In his last role with the FBI, Jim led the team that developed and implemented the FBI's national strategy to combat cybercrime. So I think it's going to be a terrific afternoon in November, and I hope you can join us. I also hope you can join us on October 17th for a webinar on surviving the breach. We'll get more information in your hands in the next couple of days. And lastly, if any of you are attending the NACD Global Board Leaders Summit in National Harbor, Maryland next week, Ken Hoganson, the founder and chair of the Private Directors Association, will be a speaker on private equity and wealth management creation. So please take the opportunity to listen to Ken and to introduce yourself to him as well.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate it. I just want to say thank you so much to Mary and to Mark, and also to my colleague Diane Johnson, who's been helping to make sure that this session goes smoothly, and also to all of you. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to attend today's session. I'm going to turn it back over to Diane, who's going to wrap up. But again, thank you everyone for your participation, and it's been great speaking with you. Diane?
Thank you, Dottie. We want to thank each of you for joining us today. And just as a reminder, this replay of this webinar will be sent out to you shortly. Thank you again, and have a great day.